Hello to all our listeners, and thank you for joining us for the third and final episode dedicated to the Book of Ruth. On the surface, the love story that sprouted and grew in the wheat fields under the bright blue skies of ancient Israel resembles countless Cinderella tales. Like all of Cinderella's fairy tales, the Book of Ruth describes a poor, lonely girl whose hardships end when a wealthy, kind-hearted man falls in love with her and marries her. However, the author of our book, who lived about 3,000 years ago, did not simply rehash a trite, overused literary romance. Instead, he created a superlative work of literature that is justly included among the most beautiful and sophisticated short stories ever written. The claim that the Book of Ruth is a literary masterpiece requires proof, and we will prove it in this episode. One of the most exquisite elements in the story is the integration of many biblical laws within it, without stating any of them overtly. Let us give a few examples. The author did not explain why Naomi released her ownership of Ruth and Orpah and even urged them to return home and remarry. However, in Deuteronomy 25, there is a law that states that the widow remains in the custody of her dead husband's family. Therefore, Naomi had the legal right to keep her daughters-in-law in her custody. Naomi let Ruth and Orpah free because she recognized that they did not belong to any family framework in Israel that could provide them protection and that she could not ensure their well-being. The author did not say a word about Naomi and Ruth's economic situation, but the fact that Ruth went after the harvesters to glean the barley they left behind reveals that the economy of both was based on the social law called gleaning, corners, and forgotten produce, which was intended to provide minimal subsistence for the poor. When Boaz instructed his workers to allow Ruth to take as much as she could carry from the crops of his field, he removed the restriction that required her to glean only in the area designated for the poor. The author did not say that Elimelech's land was mortgaged to a creditor who did not belong to the tribe of Judah, and therefore one of his relatives was obligated to redeem it. However, the law of redemption was the topic of the nighttime conversation between Ruth and Boaz, and the trial that took place at Bethlehem's gate. The Book of Ruth incorporates additional laws that we discussed in the last two episodes, but we will suffice with just one more example. As we recall, Boaz paid off Elimelech's debt. By doing so, Elimelech's land returned to Judah's territory. However, since he married Ruth according to the Levirate marriage laws, the land returned to Elimelech's house. This is because Obed, the firstborn son that Ruth bore to him, was formally considered the son of Mahlon, her first husband. The legal outcome of this U-turn was that Boaz created an inheritor and continuity for Elimelech's family, which was extinct. He also renewed the formal relationship between the two women who were like mother and daughter to each other. The examples we gave, which appear numerous times throughout the Bible, contrast sharply with contemporary writing styles. Today, we carefully cite every source and explain everything in detail. In sharp contrast, the writers of the Bible ignored the source on which they were based. Rather, they integrated them into the story, and so did the author of our story. As a rule, they avoided interrupting the flow of the story with quotations and explanations. Another literary technique in this beautiful book is the relationship between Boaz and Naomi. Two of the three main characters in the story never meet and never exchange a word. The relationship between them takes place through Ruth, which creates the feeling that they are conversing and coordinating their positions. The Cinderella stories we know from childhood contain a classic triangle: the girl, the prince, and the witch who tried to harm Cinderella. Cinderella symbolizes the virginal, helpless good. She is always beautiful, pure, and phlegmatic. Yes, phlegmatic. The witch, or the wicked stepmother, symbolizes the satanic element in human nature. She is always evil. She is jealous of Cinderella and tries to kill her. She tempted her to eat a poisoned apple, disguised herself in the form of a wolf, or pricked Cinderella's finger on an enchanted spindle. Helpless Cinderella is a perfect victim, and because she is a weak figure, she falls into the witch's plots. Her weakness is what opens the door for the prince, the strong, brave savior who represents the powers of light. The prince attracts the spineless Cinderella and endangers his life to save her. He battles against the evil stepmother and vanquishes her. Then he marries Cinderella, and since then she has lived happily ever after to this day. By contrast, the triangle of our story is the antithesis of Cinderella's stories. Each one of the three main characters is kind and infuses the other two with his goodness and compassion. And this is the place to tell our listeners that in Hebrew, the original language of the Bible, the Book of Ruth has another name, the Book of Benevolence, or the Book of Kindness. Our Ruth is not one of the dull, cookie-cutter Cinderellas created by a Massey on a production line. She is not a weak, frail Cinderella. Although the author described her as a young girl who still needs a mother, Ruth is stubborn. She knows what she wants and cannot be deflected from her goal. Her devotion to Naomi does not come from a position of submission, but rather from a position of love, assertiveness, and decisiveness. Ruth is the only female character in the Bible who was given the option to choose her fate, and she chooses not to return to her father's home, but to go with Naomi and bear the burden of supporting them both. We will return to this point shortly. Naomi is the direct opposite of the classical stepmother who tries to harm her stepdaughter. Naomi represents the good and loving matriarch. She is a warm woman in whose lap Ruth could lay her head, close her eyes, and fall asleep after a long day working in the field. A woman like Naomi would not hesitate to send her beloved daughter to the man she had chosen if she had decided he was the best man for her. Boaz, the male side of the triangle, is a true fairy tale prince. The expansive heart that beat in his breast was big enough to embrace the two women as if they were one entity. Boaz did not save Ruth by banishing Naomi from her path, but by becoming the glue that reattached two ribs that had come apart. In episode 12 of the previous series, we examined a fascinating theological phenomenon that only those who follow the genealogical lists in the book of Genesis can discern. It is that the Bible tells a story of one chosen lineage, the lineage leading to King David, which God chose on the sixth day of creation. We also showed that not only David's forefathers were chosen heroes, but so were his ancient mothers, and that they all belonged to Abraham's extended family. We said that when there was a threat that a woman whom God did not choose might marry one of David's ancestors, the chosen mother who lived in that generation arose and corrected the mistake. Sarah removed the Egyptian Hagar and her son Ishmael from Isaac's path. Rebekah persuaded Jacob to impersonate his brother Esau and receive Isaac's blessing, because Esau, his twin brother, had married two Canaanite women. Jacob fell in love with the beautiful Rachel, but Rachel was an ordinary woman, not a chosen one, and if that wasn't enough due to Leah's disability, she was supposed to be married with the status of a concubine. Here Laban, the father of the two sisters, corrected the mistake. Judah, after whom the tribe of Judah was named, married a Canaanite woman who bore him 3 sons. Since the 3 sons were born to a Canaanite woman, Judah had no heir who could be one of David's ancestors, and the brave Tamar was the one who corrected the mistake and bore him Perez. And now we come to Ruth. Ruth was a daughter of Moab, and the book of Deuteronomy 23 explicitly states that Israelites are forbidden to marry Moabites. Quote, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of Israel. No descendants of such, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of God." Given the restrictions on Moabites entering the Israelite community, how can we explain that Ruth the Moabite was David's great-grandmother? This question leads us to examine the moral aspect of the Bible, which is evident in every story. The Bible contains numerous laws given by God, both theological laws and social law. The theological laws concerning the priestly worship of God, ritual times, and many more. The social laws were designed to establish a moral and just society. For example, the first of the 10 Commandments is a theological law that commands the Israelites to believe only in God. This law is followed by 9 social and egalitarian laws, which teach that all Israelites are equal before the law, and the immense importance that God attributed to a society that operates according to his laws. Throughout the Bible, we can find dozens of social laws, such as the law of redemption, the law of gleaning corners and forgotten produce, which focus on caring for the poor. The book of Psalms presents another moral law. Quote, "Do not cast me away when I am old. Do not forsake me when my strength is gone." 71:8. Ruth fulfilled this law. She fulfilled it because her conscience directed her to do so, not because it was written in the Bible. We must not forget that when Naomi released her authority from her and Orpah, Ruth could have returned to her father's house in Moab, as Orpah did. If she behaved so, then the old Naomi would have died deserted and in great poverty. But Naomi did not die lonely. She passed away in peace and tranquility with Ruth and Boaz by her side, and Obed, who was considered her grandson. Without expecting any reward, Ruth chose to go to a foreign land, whose language she did not speak and where she knew no one. And God in heaven recognized the goodness of this girl's heart, and rewarded her generously and justly, placed her alongside Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Tamar. Let's summarize the artistic aspects of the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is considered a masterpiece of literature and is rightfully included among the most beautiful short stories ever written. The author wrote for people who lived more than 3,000 years ago when Bethlehem was a small agricultural village near Jerusalem, and Moab was still existing in what is now the Kingdom of Jordan. Ruth, of course, was named after her land of origin. Since the story is set in Bethlehem, which was surrounded by wheat fields, we can assume the author lived there, and this is why he knew that the spring in this area started in March. It's important to note the vast difference between modern women's lives in Western society to Ruth, who represents in this story all the women who lived in the ancient world. Today, our daughters leave home around the age of 18. They travel, work, or study professions that will support them and their families in the future. In sharp contrast, women in the ancient lived with their nuclear and extended families, which provided for all their needs. The biblical heroines didn't travel to distant lands or study professions for future self-support. In this context, Ruth's story is exceptional. Ruth voluntarily left her birthplace for a foreign land, which also demonstrates her unique personality. Before we tell you about our next series, we must emphasize that we need our listeners' support to produce more episodes. Our podcast requires expertise in various fields, including extensive historical knowledge, familiarity with ancient Israeli legal and social practices, and proficiency in biblical Hebrew. Those willing to support this unique project can visit our beautiful website, designed by Omer Binder, and contribute through the Patreon page or by buying us a coffee. Those interested in purchasing Dr. Ravid's book, Daily Life in Biblical Times, can do so through our podcast's website. The book examines the actions of biblical heroes, considering the social and legal norms that obligated them to act in that way and not in another way. Ravid's book contains translations of numerous puns and wordplays that offer additional insights into the stories, which are lost in the English translation. Our first 15 episodes covered famous biblical family stories. Our next series will focus on the two creation stories that open the Bible, approaching them from a new perspective. The first creation story tells that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. To many, this story sounds naive, but this story is the basis for a long series of revolutionary social laws unprecedented in human history, some of which we wish still existed in the modern Western society in which we live. The second creation story focuses on the events in the Garden of Eden that led to Adam and Eve's expulsion. We'll ask why God forbade the first couple to eat from the tree of knowledge, which enabled them to recognize his existence and understand his laws. The fruit from the tree of knowledge enables them to distinguish between God and evil deeds and distinguish the human being from the animals who act according to their instincts. If so, what explains God's prohibition? Good question, isn't it? Until we produce new episodes, farewell and best wishes to all. Please share our podcast with friends and loved ones.